1950 was such a busy year in ufology that we had to split it into 2 episodes. This episode covers the most interesting and detailed cases of the second half of the year. The 9 locations in this episode include Westminster, Massachusetts, Cours, France, Columbus, Ohio, Lincoln, Nebraska, Penon de los Banos, Mexico City, Desierto de los Leones National Park, Mexico City, Vaux in Dieulet, France, Quebec, Canada, Bucaramanga, Colombia. Please let us know in the comments section how many of these cases you've heard about before. Are UFOs and UAP real?
The truth is that we've never proved one, but there are things flying around up there that we haven't fully identified yet.
UFO and UAP have been here for a long time.
There's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are.
UFO and UAP are a global phenomenon.
I won't talk to you about what I know about it, but it's very interesting. But Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
These close encounters are categorized into 5 different categories. It's the morning in the fall of 1950, and we're in Westminster, Massachusetts. We have a close encounter of the 4th kind. 13-year-old Betty Aho had left the house to play when she saw an object like a moon grow larger. She was then unable to move. Suddenly, she found herself inside a white room feeling relaxed. Then 3 small beings glided towards her. The beings were classic grays, humanoid, 2.5 to 3 feet tall, gray skin, large oval-shaped heads, and huge black oval-shaped eyes. They wore silvery white coveralls which seemed to blend with the mist and bright light in the room. They reassured her, and one raised his hand, and she felt sleepy. She floated with the beings into a cold, misty room where she was suspended in midair over a box-like table. The beings placed globes of light by her head and feet, and then beams of light closed in a square around her. The beings escorted her to a dark room where 2 more beings met her. These were 5 feet tall and wore gray coveralls. She was greeted by name and told she was going to take a ride. They laid her on a large round cushion and fitted a mouthpiece device around her tongue. A being relieved her discomfort by laying a hand on her forehead. She began spinning and felt acceleration. A mist fell on her and lights flashed throughout a glass dome above her. Her craft crashed into a body of water and came out. She saw a great tunnel, apparently made of ice, where crystals held a collection of humans dressed in various ethnic and historical costumes, much like a museum. She left the craft and entered a dark, misty region filled with objects resembling UFOs. A taller being escorted her to a clam-shaped transport through a subterranean conduit as she approached her destination, which was a great door in a glass wall where she was to meet the One. She had an out-of-body experience and entered through the door. The events inside remained a secret. Soon, a tall human with white hair and dressed in a white luminous robe directed her to another clamshell transport. When she emerged, a tall humanoid being escorted her to a mine tunnel where several small beings cut blue stones from a wall. She re-entered a craft, and a being had her operate a console. She was then floated onto a table. The beings then apparently removed her right eye and implanted a tiny device deep within her head. She was then extensively examined and scanned. Following other procedures, she was promised that she could go home. Her next memory was of being in a field near her home, near a landed craft that was shaped like a sphere of reflective metal and was standing on 3 legs. Beams of solid light were coming from the top and stopped as if they were chopped off. A door and a sunburst emblem were also visible. She crossed the field with a taller being in front and 2 smaller beings behind carrying luminous globes. The taller being told her that they were watching over her and that she had to forget the experience. It's 4 p.m. on May 20th of 1950. We're in Cours, France, and we have a close encounter of the 4th kind. A woman walking on a road along the steep banks of the River Loire suddenly found herself within a brilliant, blinding light, and she saw 2 huge black hands appear in front of her. Each one had 5 fingers of a black color with a yellowish tint somewhat like copper. These hands did not come from behind her, but from above, as if they had been hanging over her head waiting for the proper time to catch her. The black hands did not immediately apply themselves to her head. She probably took 2 or 3 steps before they touched her. The hands had no visible arms. The 2 black hands were applied to her face with violence and squeezed her head as a bird of prey rushes onto its unfortunate helpless victim. They pulled her head back against a very hard chest, one that seemed to be made of iron. She felt cold throughout her hair and behind her neck, but no contact with clothes. The hands were squeezing her head like a formidable vice, not abruptly, but gradually. They were very cold, and their touch made her think that they were not made of flesh. The large fingers were placed on her eyes, and she could not see anymore, on her nose so that she could not breathe, and also on her mouth to prevent her from crying out. When she was surrounded by the strong, blinding light, she had the feeling she had been paralyzed, and when the hands touched her, she had the very distinct impression of a strong electrical discharge, as if a lightning bolt had shaken her. Her whole body was annihilated, helpless, without reflexes. For a little over a minute she felt his hands tightening very strongly on either side of her throat. It was horribly painful. Then he began to swing her forward and backward several times, still fiercely squeezing her head against his chest. She had the distinct impression that this being wore armor or a steel carapace or some very hard and cold material. She felt his two invisible arms pressing heavily on her shoulders. It was at that moment that she heard his laugh, a strange laugh she could not explain. It was as if she heard him through some water, and yet it seemed quite close above her head. At first it sounded rough and hushed, then rather strong and rolling. It made her shudder and hurt her. After a few seconds the laugh stopped, suddenly cut off. Then a knee hit her on her back, hurting her very much as if it were made of steel. This blow made her fall back, and the unknown aggressor made her lie down, still squeezing her head against his chest. Then he dragged her along the path by her head, and he seemed in a great hurry. She did not hear him breathe. He pulled her into a brush filled with brambles and nettles and acacias, still going backward at an incredible speed, holding her head. At this moment she heard his voice above her, and it said, "There she is, we've got her," as if he were talking to someone else, some accomplice who had stayed inside the bush. This voice, like the laugh, seemed close by, although hushed by some obstacle, and it was short, rough, sharply cut. She was choking and felt she was going to die. Her whole life passed before her in a few seconds. Her aggressor pulled her through the bushes until they reached a small pasture, and suddenly he stopped. His hands had gradually slipped down her face, and she tried to call for help, but she had no voice left but a tiny, shrill cry. After a while, she was able to sit among the brambles. She had a very hard time breathing. Her bag was still in her hand with the money it contained. At last she was able to get up in spite of her weakness, and then she heard some noise to her left inside the bushes. She thought she was going to see her aggressors and recognize their faces, but she saw nothing. Only the branches moved, waving in the air. She saw and heard the brambles scratching the empty space, and the grass being pressed as if under the steps of some invisible being. She was terrified, softly then took to the path again, walking with difficulty. Her legs were lacerated and bleeding. She felt a strange sensation of nervous exhaustion, indefinable, as if a strong current had electrified her. In her mouth was a sickening, metallic, bitter taste. Her muscles did not obey her. Over her shoulders she felt something like a bar, and in her back a painful heat, as if she had been exposed to flames or to a burning ray. She must have walked like that for 5 or 6 minutes. At the end of the path there was a turn, and from there she could see houses, and then the pain ceased a little bit. Everything had lasted a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes. Abruptly she heard a great noise, like a violent wind during a storm, a sudden displacement of warm air, or a violent whirlwind. She saw the trees bending as if under a sudden storm, and she was nearly thrown down. Almost simultaneously there was a strong, blinding white light. She had the feeling that something flew through the air very fast, but she saw nothing. Soon everything became calm again. She felt discomfort and nausea. Later investigation revealed that in some places the brush was black and scorched, at some other places it was pressed and flattened. The fences in the pasture, which were made of wooden posts and barbed wire, had suffered also. Some posts were burned, others pulled out, and the barbed wire had been wrenched away and broken. The previous day in the evening, the witness in this case had observed a kind of shooting star, which stopped abruptly, then appeared to go up and stay among the other stars for a while. Then it grew bigger and took on kind of a swinging motion, its light alternating on and off. It's evening of November 25th in 1950. We're in Columbus, Ohio, and we have a close encounter of the fourth kind. A man is lying in bed with that strange feeling that he's being watched, but eventually falls asleep. He's awakened by a tall, beautiful, human-like figure with angelic features. The mysterious visitor raises his hand and causes the bedroom door to open. The visitor then explains that he had come from a faraway planet and wants the man to accompany him there. The man agreed and was gone for 2 days. When he got back home from this remarkable trip, he found that a snowstorm had formed huge snowdrifts all around his house. The visitor helped him out by using a laser beam to melt the snow. 1950, we're in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we have a close encounter of the fourth kind. A young boy is outside with some other people, and they see a craft with swirling lights suddenly appear. The boy was unable to move as he saw the craft land nearby. 3 little men appeared and apparently began repairing the craft. He was taken inside the craft where he saw everybody else apparently paralyzed or frozen in time. A woman now approached him and communicated with him, telling him that she had changed her appearance so he would not be traumatized. He was then taken into an examining room where several lizard or reptilian-like humanoids examined him. It's March 13th of 1950, and we're in Penon de los Banos, Mexico City, and we have a close encounter of the third kind. Penon de los Banos, or Hill of the Baths, is one of the original rocky islands in Lake Texcoco that was drained to create Mexico City. This hill is named after the natural hot springs that come up from the base of the hill. Even with the lake being drained and this island hill now just being part of a neighborhood, the hot springs is still available for the public to enjoy. A Martian spaceship, 27 foot by 18 foot in size, equipped with a powerful propeller and made of a metal which defies gravity, landed, and the pilot engaged one of the natives in conversation in perfect Spanish. He told him that Martian cities are underground, they have found Venus too hot and humid, and it's infested with flying reptiles. They also said they will colonize Earth after we destroy ourselves in World War III. After the ship took off, there was a strong odor of sulfur remaining. It's the evening in May of 1950, and we're in Desierto de los Leones, Mexico, and we have a close encounter of the third kind. Desierto de los Leones is a national park located in the Sierra de las Cruces mountain range, entirely within the limits of Mexico City. Samael Aun Weor, born Victor Manuel Gomez Rodriguez, was a teacher and author of over 60 books of esoteric spirituality. He formed a prominent movement under the banner of Universal Gnosticism. Samael was out sightseeing in the evening when he suddenly caught sight of a strange craft that slowly descended into a clearing. Curious, he approached the area and was surprised to see a spherical craft, somewhat flattened at the top, which had landed on a tripod-like landing gear. A hatch-like opening became visible, and a man of medium stature, thin, with bronze skin, blue eyes, and a broad forehead stepped out, descending to the ground on a small metallic ladder. He carried an unknown object in his right hand. Several similar figures, both male and female, closely followed behind him. Unafraid, the witness approached the group and saluted them in Spanish, which they answered in perfect Spanish. The witness was impressed when the visitors told him that they knew all the languages on Earth. At this point, Samael felt an immense yearning to visit other worlds in the universe, and grabbing one of the tripod legs, he asked the leader of the group if they could take him to Mars. The alien leader acted surprised and told him that, why Mars? It was too close. At this point, the leader called the other group, and they held a meeting sitting on top of several dead tree trunks. Again, Samael approached and begged them to take him to visit other civilizations in space. Their leader remained quiet, while the group remained sitting on the tree trunks. One of the female aliens then stood up and told the witness a strange parable. If we take a perfume-scented plant and place it next to one that's not, it's obvious that the one who is not will eventually absorb the aroma of the scented plant. Isn't that right? Samael agreed. She then mentioned that the same applies with other worlds that at first were on the wrong path, but little by little they were radiated by the positive vibrations of other worlds and eventually changed for the better. She then pointed out that for some unknown reason, the same was not true for the planet Earth. What is happening with your Earth? She added. Samael was at a loss for words and could only say that the Earth was a mistake of the gods. The rest of the alien crew seemed to agree with a respectful bow of their heads. Soon they all stood up and prepared to leave, but not before Samael asked them one more time. Their leader's only response was that, "We will watch you along the way." At this point, Samael understood that he was not ready. He stood and watched as the alien group re-entered their craft and watched the object rotate on its axis and rise slowly into the air and then shoot away at tremendous speed. It's 6:30 in the morning in May of 1950, and we're in Vaux and Dieulet near Bucaramanga, France, and we have a close encounter of the third kind. Mr. Pirard and his sister's daughter, 14-year-old Madeline, had gone to check out the cows accompanied by their dog. As they were crossing the field, the young girl screamed and pointed to the sky to what at first she thought was the sun. Then they heard a strange noise resembling ho, ho, ho. It was a ball of fire that approached them and passed in front of the pair. The object stopped to hover, and both noticed that it was in fact a saucer-shaped object made out of a completely translucent material like glass. Inside they could clearly see a small man about 4 feet tall, with arms on its side, wearing what appeared to be a tight-fitting diving suit. He was absolutely motionless. His suit resembled that of a popular Michelin man in the ads that were run locally. He wore something resembling a motorcycle helmet with a visor made out of a clear plexiglass-like material. It had two pipes that connected to two bottles above its shoulders. Both witnesses felt totally paralyzed during the observation and felt a heat wave enveloping them. After 2 minutes, the object rose, then turned slightly on itself while going up in successive steps, emitting the same noise as in the beginning. The object disappeared in the direction of Buzancy. A scorched area was found on the ground. It's around sunset on July 9th of 1950, and we're in Hasselbach, Germany. There's a close encounter of the third kind. Oskar Link, a 48-year-old German, had recently escaped from East Germany. He was the former mayor of Gleimershausen and escaped with his wife and 6 children. Oskar and his 11-year-old daughter Gabriella were returning home on his motorcycle when a tire blew out near the town of Hasselbach. They began pushing the motorcycle and continued on walking towards home. Gabriella stopped and pointed out something about 460 feet away. Since it was around sunset, Oskar thought she was pointing at a young deer. They left the motorcycle near a tree and walked closer. At about 180 feet away, Oskar noticed that it was not a deer at all. Instead, he saw 2 men wearing shiny metallic clothing. One of them had a large lamp on his chest that lit up at regular intervals. They were stooped over and looking at something lying on the ground. They kept walking towards the men until they were about 30 feet away. Oskar looked over a small fence and saw a disc craft sitting on the ground. It was about 45 feet wide and had a 10-foot-tall conical tower. Around the central rim of the disc were 2 rows of holes. The rows were about 1.5 feet apart. Gabriella had stayed back a little behind Oskar and called out to him at that moment. The 2 men must have heard her because they immediately jumped on the conical tower and disappeared inside. The area around the center of the craft, where the holes were, began to glitter and glow a greenish color that later turned to red, and the craft began to hum slightly. As the hum got louder and the lights got brighter, the conical tower began to slide down into the center of the craft, which rose a little and began to rotate like a top. As the craft spun, the conical tower continued to descend until it protruded from the bottom of the disc, which appeared to be spinning on the tower itself. It looked almost like a mushroom. As the craft started to lift off the ground, the conical tower also lifted until it was no longer protruding from the bottom of the craft and was back in its vertical position. The craft continued to ascend and became surrounded by a ring of flames. As its rate of ascension increased, they heard a whistling sound similar to when a bomb falls. The craft then turned in the direction of Stockholm and flew off over the hills at a speed he had never seen before. What they had seen was so unusual that they were immediately ready to disbelieve what their own eyes had just seen, except for the fact that it left a large depression in the ground matching the shape of the conical tower. It's 2 a.m. in summer of 1950, and we're in Quebec, Canada. We have a close encounter of the third kind. A man was returning to his home after spending the night playing checkers with his neighbors. The weather was nice and it was a clear night. He was using an isolated road when he noticed, by a nearby farm, a bright light. At the same time, he heard noises that sounded metallic in nature. After a moment of hesitation, he approached the area. He soon heard what appeared to be shouts and thought he had run into some type of clandestine still operation. He then heard more voices and saw the object that was emitting the light. It was a luminous disc about 20 feet in diameter, suspended about 10 feet from the ground. Close to the object, illuminated by the light, stood a well-built figure about 5 foot in height, thin and young in appearance. Unafraid, the witness approached the figure and noticed that it wore phosphorescent clothing, and on the face it wore a mask, which appeared to be made out of leather, with 2 holes where the eyes would have been. The mask started in the center of the face and ended right under the mouth. The figure pronounced some words in an unknown language resembling German. At this moment, the witness perceived some movement around under the craft and saw another figure emerge from the bottom of the luminous object. The second figure was smaller than the first, built in the same way, with a larger head covered in some kind of hood. It had broad shoulders and an arched back. On a belt it carried an object similar to a flashlight. This figure pointed the instrument at the witness, who at once felt totally paralyzed but able to hear everything around him. The 2 beings then started conversing amongst each other, and the character with the flashlight approached the witness. It touched the witness with a deformed arthritic finger. It then removed its hood, and the witness saw a deformed face with wrinkled skin and 2 round black eyes, one in a lower position than the other. Its face did not have the least mobility. It stared at the witness briefly and then put its hood back on. Both humanoids then began speaking among each other in a very loud tone and walked back to the craft and were last seen entering the object via a small escalator. The man then apparently blacked out and did not see the object depart. It's 7 p.m. in 1950. We're in Bucaramanga, Colombia, and we have a close encounter of the third kind. 13-year-old deaf-mute William Ortiz was riding his horse on a gravel road on his parents' property when, peering through the growth of vegetation on one side of the road, he noticed a childlike figure but continued on his way. Then, in an opening through the brush and on top of a large rock, he saw a disc-shaped object with little figures around it. After staring at it, he stopped in confusion, looked over his shoulder, and noticed one of the childlike figures next to him. He noticed that the entity wore some type of uniform, very tight-fitting and covering the neck and legs. He also wore boots. The collar ended like a turtleneck, and he could see something like a seam in the form of a V on the shoulders. The hands only had 4 fingers. The being had a large, hairless head. The eyes were big, oval-shaped, and very black. Some of the other crew members' eyes were smaller than the others. There were no ears, just a little hole on each side of the head. The nose was small, as well as the lips, which never moved. The skin color was grayish-brown. The entity closest to him appeared to be a male. The others looked the same. The entity closest to him looked directly into Ortiz's eyes and started sending him messages, and at the same time using hand signals or language. 8 enigmatic words were given by the entity, which included sky, love, and secret. After the message, the entity made a turn towards the rock. At this moment, Ortiz could not see the rest of the crew. The entity went back to the object, half walking, half floating, very fast. Then the object went straight up, made a turn to the southwest, and disappeared into the horizon. The rock on which the object rested has many peculiar symbols carved on it that included lines, circles, disc shapes, serpents, and other mysterious symbols. If you enjoy this type of content, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to make sure that you don't miss a thing.